The first shot rang out like a death knell across the Montana prairie, sending Thomas Reed diving from his horse just as the second bullet whistled past his ear. The year was 1875, and the untamed western frontier showed no mercy to those who rode alone. Thomas hit the ground hard, a sharp pain lancing through his left side as he rolled behind a large boulder. His hand instinctively went to his ribs, feeling the unnatural give beneath his fingers. The crack had been audible, even over the gunfire. His Winchester rifle remained strapped to his saddle, and his horse had bolted at the first shot, leaving him with only his Colt revolver and 6 bullets between him and whoever had decided he shouldn't see another sunrise. "Come on out, Reed," a gruff voice called from the ridge. "Boss wants what you stole," Thomas grimaced. He hadn't stolen anything except his own freedom from the Circle M Ranch and its merciless owner, Maxwell Corbin. 3 years of honest work ended the moment Thomas had witnessed Corbin gun down a Cheyenne family who'd been peacefully trading at the ranch. When Thomas had confronted him, Corbin had laughed and offered him a raise to keep quiet. Instead, Thomas had packed his belongings that night and fled. Now, a week later, Corbin's men had caught up to him. With each breath sending white-hot pain through his side, Thomas knew he couldn't outrun them with a cracked rib. He needed help, and soon. The ridge above him fell silent. Thomas peered cautiously around the boulder, spotting movement in the brush about 200 yards away. At least 3 men, maybe more. Too many for him to take on, especially injured. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the prairie. If he could just hold out until dark, he might have a chance. Another shot kicked up dirt near his boots, forcing Thomas to pull back. His breathing came in short, painful gasps. Just as despair began to creep in, the distant sound of wagon wheels caught his attention. Someone was coming along the trail below. Thomas edged to the side of the boulder, trying to see who approached. A small covered wagon came into view, driven by a woman with copper hair caught in the fading sunlight. She was alone, unaware of the danger ahead. "Turn back." Thomas shouted, then immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his side and his position was revealed by another shot. The woman reined in her horses, looking up toward the ridge with alarm. Instead of fleeing as any sensible person would, she quickly guided her wagon off the trail and into a stand of cottonwoods. Thomas watched in disbelief as she jumped down, grabbed a rifle from beneath the seat, and took up a position behind her wagon. "Whoever's up there better clear out." Her clear voice rang across the valley. "The cavalry patrol is right behind me, and they don't take kindly to bushwhackers." It was a bluff. Thomas could see no dust on the trail behind her, but a convincing one. After a moment of silence, the men on the ridge began to withdraw, muttering curses. They weren't being paid enough to tangle with army troops. Thomas waited until he was certain they'd gone before attempting to move. Each breath felt like fire in his chest as he stumbled down the slope toward the wagon. The woman watched his approach warily, rifle still at the ready. "That was some bluff," he managed, clutching his side. "No patrol coming, is there?" "Not for miles," she replied, lowering her weapon slightly but not completely. "You hurt, cracked rib, I think, when I fell from my horse." Thomas leaned against a tree, suddenly dizzy. "Name's Thomas Reed." "I'm much obliged for the assistance, miss. Vivian Blackwell. Most folks call me Vive." Her green eyes assessed him critically. "Those men were after you specifically, called you by name." Thomas nodded, then winced. "Former employer with a grudge. I quit without giving notice." "Must have been some job to warrant getting shot over," she remarked, finally lowering her rifle completely. "You don't look like an outlaw, but appearances can be deceiving out here." "I'm no outlaw," Thomas assured her. "Just a cowhand who saw something I shouldn't have." Vivian seemed to make a decision, tucking a strand of copper hair behind her ear. "Well, Mr. Reed, I can't leave you out here for those men to finish off when they realize there's no patrol. Let's get you in the wagon. I've got supplies to tend that rib." Thomas hesitated. "They might come back." "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "Trouble finds me regardless," she said with a wry smile. "I'm heading to Cold Creek. It's about 15 miles west. You're welcome to ride along that far." The mention of Cold Creek was a stroke of luck. Thomas had been headed there himself, having heard they needed experienced cowhands for the spring cattle drive. With a grateful nod, he accepted her offer and let her help him into the wagon bed. The interior of the wagon was neat and organized, filled with crates of medical supplies and instruments Thomas didn't recognize. "You a doctor?" he asked in surprise. "Midwife and healer," Vivian corrected, rummaging through a wooden box. "My father was a doctor back east. He taught me what he could before he passed. Now I go where I'm needed." She helped Thomas remove his vest and shirt, her touch professional but gentle. The bruising along his left side was already darkening to an ugly purple. Vivian pressed carefully around the area, causing Thomas to inhale sharply. "It hurts," he whispered, embarrassed by the admission of weakness. Vivian's eyes softened. "Then let me hold you till it doesn't," she said, her voice low as she reached for bandages. "I'm going to wrap these ribs tight to support them while they heal. It won't take away the pain completely, but it'll help." True to her word, she positioned herself behind him, supporting his weight against her as she began the delicate process of binding his ribs. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd been held by anyone, the simple human contact almost as soothing as the medical care. "How'd you end up out here alone?" he asked, trying to distract himself from both the pain and the unexpected intimacy. "Same as most people, I suppose." "Seeking something." She worked methodically, her breath warm against his shoulder. "After my father died, there wasn't much left for me in Philadelphia. Too many doctors competing for too few patients who'd accept a woman's care. Out here, people are less particular when they're hurting." "Your husband doesn't mind you traveling alone." Vivian's hands paused briefly. "No husband, never found a man who could accept a wife with a profession of her own." She resumed her work. "There, that should hold. Try to breathe normally, but not too deep." Thomas carefully tested the bandages, finding the stabbing pain had reduced to a dull ache. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for scaring off those men." "You can repay me by telling me the truth about why they're hunting you," Vivian said, moving to sit across from him. "If I'm harboring you, I deserve to know what I'm risking." Thomas nodded slowly. As the wagon began to move, he told her everything about the 3 years he'd spent working for Maxwell Corbin, about the Cheyenne family who'd come to trade furs for supplies, and about Corbin's cold-blooded murder of all 5 of them when a disagreement arose over the trade value. "I should have done something," Thomas said, self-loathing evident in his voice. "But I was frozen. By the time I found my voice to protest, it was too late. They were already dead." "And Corbin told you to keep quiet," Vivian guessed. "Offered me a promotion and extra pay." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "I packed my things that night and rode out before dawn. Been running ever since." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, guiding her horses along the darkening trail. "Have you considered going to the law?" Thomas gave a bitter laugh that made his ribs ache. "Corbin is the law in Henderson County. The sheriff's his cousin. The territorial marshal is 3 days' ride away, and even if I could reach him, it would be my word against Corbin's. A rich rancher versus a drifting cowhand." "So you're just going to keep running, for now," Thomas admitted. "At least until I can figure out a better plan. Maybe find work far enough away that Corbin won't bother pursuing me." Vivian nodded thoughtfully. "Cold Creek might be a good start. It's in the next county over. Different jurisdiction. As night fell, Vivian guided the wagon off the trail to make camp. Thomas insisted on helping despite her protests, gathering wood for a small fire while she tended the horses. The simple domestic routine felt strangely comfortable, as if they'd traveled together for months rather than hours. Over a simple meal of beans and salt pork, Thomas found himself sharing stories of his childhood in Missouri, of leaving home at 16 to find his fortune in the West, of the skills he'd learned working cattle drives across Texas and Kansas. In turn, Vivian told him about growing up watching her father treat patients in their Philadelphia home, about studying medical texts by candlelight while other girls her age attended parties and sought husbands. Never really fit the mold they had for women back east, she explained, her face golden in the firelight. Out here, being different isn't quite so scandalous. Still takes courage, Thomas observed. Traveling alone, practicing medicine, most women would have sought the protection of a husband. Vivian's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Most men I've encountered wanted a wife, not a partner. I wasn't willing to give up one dream for another. Thomas watched her across the fire, struck by her quiet strength. The right man wouldn't ask you to choose. Their eyes met briefly before Vivian looked away. Perhaps, but I've yet to meet him. In the morning, Thomas awoke to find his ribs aching less, though movement was still painful. Vivian checked his bandages, her fingers cool against his skin, before they continued their journey toward Cold Creek. The small town appeared on the horizon by mid-afternoon, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley beside a swift-running creek that gave the settlement its name. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and the main street bustled with activity unusual for a frontier town of its size. Cattle drive preparations, Vivian explained as they approached. They gather here before heading north to the Montana territories. It's why I came plenty of work for someone with medical skills when there are cowboys around. Thomas couldn't help smiling despite his pain. And why I came too, looking for work with the drive. Not with those ribs, you're not, Vivian said firmly. You'll need at least 3 weeks before you can consider hard riding. The news was disappointing but not unexpected. As they rolled into town, Thomas resigned himself to finding other work until he healed. Perhaps the livery needed help, or one of the saloons needed a guard who could keep his head in a fight. Vivian directed her wagon to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. The midwife who used to serve this area passed last winter, she explained. Town council wrote asking if I'd consider taking her place. This was her home. Thomas helped unload her supplies, moving carefully to avoid aggravating his injury. The cabin was modest but solid, with 2 rooms and a small covered porch. Inside, dust covered the simple furnishings, but the structure was sound. It needs some work, Vivian admitted, looking around, but it's more permanent than I've had in some time. Thomas set down the last crate. I could help with repairs. Least I could do to repay you for saving my hide. Vivian turned to him, her expression unreadable. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Reed. Thomas, he corrected. And maybe not. But I'm handy with tools, and until these ribs heal, I can't take on regular cowhand work anyway. He hesitated, then added, unless you'd prefer I find other arrangements. Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or consideration. There's a small lean-to behind the cabin. It's not much, but you could stay there while you heal, in exchange for repairs. Thomas nodded, grateful for the opportunity to remain close. Not just because Vivian was the only person in Cold Creek he knew, but because something about her drew him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Thomas would work on repairing the cabin, fixing loose boards, patching the roof, rebuilding the neglected chicken coop while Vivian organized her supplies and began receiving patients. Word spread quickly that the new healer had arrived, and soon women from town and surrounding homesteads were visiting regularly. In the evenings, they would share quiet meals, talking about their days or simply enjoying comfortable silence. Thomas found himself looking forward to these moments more than anything else, watching the tension ease from Vivian's shoulders as she relaxed in his company. A week into his stay, Thomas was repairing the front steps when 3 riders approached the cabin. He straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver on his hip before recognizing one of the men as the town sheriff. "Afternoon," Thomas called, keeping his voice casual despite his racing heart. Had word reached Cold Creek about Maxwell Corbin's fugitive cowhand? "Afternoon," the sheriff replied, dismounting. He was a lean man with a graying mustache and shrewd eyes that took in Thomas's bandaged torso visible beneath his unbuttoned shirt. "You must be the fellow helping out Miss Blackwell. I'm Sheriff Davies." Thomas nodded, relaxing slightly. "Thomas Reed. Just doing some repairs while I heal up." "Heard you had a run-in with some trouble on the trail," Davies said. "Miss Blackwell mentioned it when she registered with the town council as our new midwife." "Nothing serious," Thomas replied carefully. "Just some disagreement with former associates." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer before changing the subject. "Actually came out to ask Miss Blackwell to attend a birth at the Johnson place. Their eldest girl's time has come early." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Vivian appeared in the doorway, already gathering her medical bag. "How far along is she?" "Water broke about an hour ago, according to Mr. Johnson. He rode in mighty fast to fetch you." Vivian nodded briskly. "I'll need to take the wagon." It could be a long night. The Johnson farm was nearly 10 miles away, and Thomas didn't like the idea of Vivian traveling alone, especially if she'd be returning after dark. "I could drive you," he offered. Vivian hesitated, clearly considering refusing before practicality won out. "Thank you. It would be helpful to have someone mind the horses while I'm inside." The sheriff seemed satisfied with this arrangement, and departed with his deputies after providing directions to the Johnson homestead. As Thomas helped Vivian load her supplies, he caught her watching him with a thoughtful expression. "What is it?" he asked. "You didn't have to offer to come along." Thomas secured the last crate in the wagon. "I know, but I wanted to." The simple admission hung between them as they set out for the Johnson farm. The day was warm for early spring, with clear skies and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant outing. They arrived at the Johnson homestead by mid-afternoon. Thomas helped Vivian carry her supplies inside before returning to tend the horses and wait. The hours stretched on, the sun sinking below the horizon as lanterns were lit inside the modest sod house. Mr. Johnson, a weather-beaten farmer with kind eyes, brought Thomas supper and offered him a place by their outdoor fire. "First baby's always the hardest," he said, his voice a mixture of worry and pride. "But Miss Blackwell seems to know her business." "She does," Thomas agreed, accepting the plate of beans and corn bread. "You're fortunate she arrived in Cold Creek when she did." Johnson nodded. "The good Lord provides. We've been praying for a new midwife since old Mrs. Henley passed last winter." He studied Thomas curiously. "You two been traveling together long?" "Just met on the trail about 10 days ago," Thomas admitted. "She helped me when I was in a tight spot." "Seems you're returning the favor," Johnson observed. "Not many men would wait all night for a birthing they're not even part of." Thomas looked toward the house, where occasional sounds of labor could be heard. "Seems like the least I can do." It was well past midnight when Vivian finally emerged from the house, exhausted but smiling. "A healthy baby girl," she announced to Thomas, who had been dozing against a wagon wheel. "Mother's resting comfortably." The relief on her face made something warm unfurl in Thomas's chest. He helped her into the wagon without comment, covering her with a blanket against the night chill before setting out for Cold Creek. "You should rest," he told her as the wagon rumbled along the moonlit trail. "I'll wake you when we get home." Vivian didn't argue, leaning against his shoulder as exhaustion claimed her. Thomas drove carefully, acutely aware of her weight against him, of the trust implicit in her willingness to sleep in his presence. His ribs ached from the long day, but he barely noticed, focused instead on delivering them safely back to the cabin. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they arrived. Thomas gently woke Vivian, who stirred against him with a soft sound that made his heart skip. "We're home," he said quietly. Vivian blinked up at him, her copper hair tousled from sleep. For a moment, neither moved, the word home hanging between them like a question. "Thank you," she finally murmured, straightening. "For coming with me." "Anytime," Thomas replied, meaning it more than he'd expected to. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. Small touches lingered longer than necessary. Conversation stretched late into the evening. Thomas found reasons to be nearby when Vivian worked in her garden, and she began bringing him coffee in the mornings before he started his repairs. 2 weeks after arriving in Cold Creek, Thomas was chopping firewood despite Vivian's protests that it was too strenuous for his healing ribs when a rider approached the cabin at a gallop. Thomas set down the axe, instantly alert. The rider reined in his lathered horse, his expression urgent. "Miss Blackwell, there's been an accident at the sawmill, 3 men hurt bad. Doc Wilson's there, but he's asking for your help." Vivian was already moving, grabbing her medical bag. "I'll come right away." She glanced at Thomas. "I may be gone for hours." "I'll come with you," he said, reaching for his hat. The sawmill at the edge of town was a scene of chaos when they arrived. A stack of logs had shifted unexpectedly, crushing one man's leg and sending 2 others tumbling into the machinery. Blood stained the sawdust-covered ground as townspeople worked to free the trapped men. Doc Wilson, a gray-haired man with a permanent stoop, looked relieved to see Vivian. "Thank God. The one with the crushed leg needs immediate attention. I'm trying to stop the bleeding on Miller over there, but I can't be in 2 places at once." Without hesitation, Vivian hurried to the injured man, kneeling beside him in the blood-soaked sawdust. Thomas followed, ready to assist however he could. What followed was hours of grim work. Vivian's hands moved with practiced precision as she cleaned, stitched, and bandaged. Thomas held tools, provided clean cloths, and helped move the injured men as needed. One man's leg couldn't be saved, and Thomas held him down as Vivian and Doc Wilson performed the amputation, the man's screams haunting despite the whiskey they'd poured down his throat to dull the pain. By sunset, the crisis had passed. 2 men would live, though one without his leg. The third had succumbed to his injuries despite their best efforts. Thomas watched as Vivian gently closed the dead man's eyes, murmuring a quiet prayer before covering his face with a clean cloth. They walked back to the cabin in exhausted silence, both spattered with blood despite their attempts to clean up. Inside, Thomas wordlessly built a fire while Vivian heated water for washing. "You did well today," she said finally, her voice hollow with fatigue. "Most men can't stomach that kind of work." Thomas handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing. "Most men haven't seen what I've seen." He hesitated, then added, "You were remarkable." Vivian looked up, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "We lost Sam Jenkins. A wife and 3 children left behind. You did everything possible," Thomas said gently. The other two are alive because of you." A tear slipped down Vivian's cheek. Without thinking, Thomas reached out to brush it away, his thumb lingering against her skin. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's always hardest when you lose them." Thomas stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Vivian." She looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her breath catch. Thomas leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she rose to meet him, their lips touching in a gentle kiss that deepened as her arms wound around his neck. Thomas pulled her closer, forgetting his injured ribs until a sharp pain made him gasp against her mouth. Vivian immediately pulled back, concern replacing desire. "Your ribs," she chided. "You've been doing too much." Thomas caught her hand before she could retreat further. "It hurts," he admitted with a rueful smile, "but I don't care." Vivian's expression softened. "Then let me hold you till it doesn't," she whispered, echoing her words from their first meeting as she carefully guided him to sit before the fire. She settled beside him, her body fitting perfectly against his uninjured side. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how right it felt to have her there. "I've never met anyone like you," he said quietly. "I came west looking for something I couldn't name, and I think maybe it was you." Vivian looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I've spent my whole life avoiding entanglements, protecting my independence, and then you stumbled into my wagon, and suddenly independence doesn't seem quite so important anymore." "I would never ask you to give up your work," Thomas assured her. "It's part of who you are." "I know," Vivian said, surprising him with another kiss. "That's why I'm falling in love with you." The admission hung in the air between them, bold and vulnerable at once. Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his heart fuller than he'd ever known it could be. "I love you, Vivian Blackwell," he replied. "And I promise, if you'll have me, I'll spend every day making sure you never regret it." Their newfound happiness was tested sooner than either expected. 3 days later, Thomas was repairing the chicken coop when the sound of multiple horses approaching drew his attention. His blood ran cold at the sight of Maxwell, Corbin himself riding at the head of 5 men, all armed. Thomas straightened slowly, aware that Vivian was inside with a patient Mrs. Peterson had brought her youngest in with a fever that morning. His revolver was inside, beyond reach. All he had was the hammer in his hand. "Well, well," Corbin drawled, reining in his horse. He was a big man with small, cruel eyes and a meticulously groomed mustache that did nothing to soften his harsh features. "Fancy finding you playing house, Reed. Thought you'd run further than this." "What do you want, Corbin?" Thomas asked, moving away from the cabin, trying to draw their attention from where Vivian and her patient were. "You know exactly what I want." Corbin dismounted, his spurs jangling against the hard, packed earth. "Can't have a man witness something and then run off telling tales. Bad for business." "I haven't told anyone," Thomas said, which was technically true. He'd told Vivian, but no one else in Cold Creek knew the real reason he'd left Henderson County. "Don't matter. You might someday." Corbin nodded to his men. "Check the cabin, make sure he's alone." Before Thomas could protest, the cabin door opened and Vivian stepped out, her expression calm despite the dangerous situation. "Gentlemen, I have a sick child inside. If you'll kindly state your business and move along, I'd be grateful." Corbin's eyes narrowed as he took in Vivian's appearance, her practical dress, the stethoscope around her neck, the quiet authority in her stance. "Who's this, Reed? Your woman?" "I'm the midwife for Cold Creek," Vivian answered before Thomas could speak. "And Mr. Reed is helping with repairs to my cabin while he recovers from an injury. Now, unless you're in need of medical attention, I'd appreciate it if you'd conduct your business elsewhere." One of Corbin's men snickered, but Corbin himself wasn't amused. "Midwife or not, madam, you're harboring a man who witnessed a private business matter and failed to keep his mouth shut about it. If you mean the murder of that Cheyenne family," Vivian said coolly, "I'd hardly call that a business matter." Thomas felt a chill run through him at her words. What was she doing? Corbin's face darkened with rage as he turned back to Thomas. "So you did talk. Guess that settles things." He reached for his revolver. "I wouldn't," Vivian said, and Thomas noticed for the first time that her right hand was behind her back. She brought it forward now, revealing the shotgun she'd kept concealed. "Sheriff Davies is on his way. I sent Mrs. Peterson's boy to fetch him the moment I saw you ride up." Corbin hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Vivian nodded toward the road, where dust was indeed rising from an approaching rider. "Care to take that chance?" It wasn't the sheriff, Thomas realized with a sinking feeling. The figure was too small, likely just Mrs. Peterson's son returning. But Corbin and his men couldn't tell that from this distance. "This isn't over, Raid," Corbin growled, backing toward his horse. "I've got friends in this county, too." "And I've got witnesses to this conversation," Thomas replied, finding his voice. "Try anything and you'll hang for it." The standoff might have continued, but the distant rider was getting closer, and Corbin's nerve faltered. With a final threatening glare, he mounted his horse and led his men away, riding hard in the opposite direction from the approaching figure. As soon as they were out of sight, Vivian's composure cracked. The shotgun trembled in her hands as Thomas gently took it from her. "That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, pulling her close despite the pain in his ribs. "He could have killed you." "He was going to kill you," Vivian countered, her voice muffled against his chest. "I couldn't let that happen." The rider, indeed Mrs. Peterson's teenage son, arrived, confused to find Vivian and Thomas embracing outside the cabin. Thomas sent him to fetch the sheriff for real this time, explaining that men had threatened them and might still be in the area. That evening, after giving statements to Sheriff Davies and ensuring that patrols would watch for Corbin and his men, Thomas and Vivian sat on the cabin's porch, hands intertwined as they watched the sunset. "We could leave," Thomas suggested. "Start fresh somewhere Corbin can't find us." Vivian squeezed his hand. "And abandon the people here who need me. Who would deliver the Johnson baby siblings or tend Mrs. Peterson's children when they are ill?" Thomas smiled despite his concern. "I knew you'd say that." "Besides," Vivian continued, "Sheriff Davies has telegraphed the territorial marshal. With my testimony backing yours, they might finally bring Corbin to justice for what he did to that family." Thomas pulled her closer. "It won't be easy. Men like Corbin have money and influence." "The best things never are easy," Vivian replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "But they're worth fighting for." 6 months later, Thomas stood nervously at the front of Cold Creek's small church, his best suit slightly tight across the shoulders. Sheriff Davies stood beside him as his best man, while the assembled townspeople watched with approving smiles. The door opened, and Vivian appeared in a simple white dress, copper hair adorned with wildflowers. Thomas felt his breath catch as she walked toward him, radiant in the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows. Maxwell Corbin was gone, not hanged as he deserved, but imprisoned in the territorial penitentiary awaiting trial for multiple murders after the marshal's investigation had uncovered far more crimes than just the Cheyenne family. The threat he had posed was over, allowing Thomas and Vivian to build their future in peace. As Vivian reached him at the altar, Thomas took her hands in his. His ribs had long since healed, but the memory of her gentle care remained vivid. "Ready," she whispered, her green eyes bright with joy. "I've been ready since the moment you said you'd hold me till it didn't hurt," Thomas replied, his voice low enough for only her to hear. They spoke their vows before God and the community that had embraced them, both he as the new foreman of the Circle S ranch outside town, she as the midwife who had brought more than a dozen new lives into the world since her arrival. That night, in the expanded cabin they now shared, Thomas held his new wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought them together. "You ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Taking in a wounded stranger who brought danger to your door?" Vivian propped herself up on one elbow, her copper hair spilling across the pillow. "Not for a single moment," she said, tracing the scar on his side where his ribs had been broken. "Some wounds heal stronger than they were before." Thomas pulled her down for a kiss. "And some hearts do too," he whispered against her lips, as the Montana moon cast silver light through their window and the promise of tomorrow waited just beyond the horizon.